Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Books and Looks. This is Blaine DeSantis, your host for our weekly look at books, things I'm reading, interviews of authors, and also maybe sometimes things I'm looking at. You know, today we have got a really fine author for you. His name is Chris Wimmer. He is a historian, he's an author, he's a podcaster, and he's going to be telling us all about his newest book, The Summer of 1876. Yep, it's the centennial year in America. You remember the centennial celebration was going on in Philadelphia when this is happening. Ulysses Grant's the president. We also have got a lot of famous people. We got the Wild Bill Hickok up in Deadwood. We've got Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp in Dodge City. We got Custer in The Last Stand. We got a bank robbery up in Northfield, Minnesota that is really a fascinating thing. So he's going to tell us all about this. He's also going to tell us about the beginning of professional baseball, because in 1876, the National League of Baseball begins. Yeah, can you believe that? It all started in 1876. It's going to be a wonderful conversation. He's got a lot of interesting facts, and we realized all the coincidences that occurred that made this such an amazing summer. Some good, some bad. He and I also dazzle each other with a little bit of little-known information. I throw one at him with Candy Cummings, a baseball player, and he comes back at me with Doc Holliday. Wow. Didn't know the Doc story, so that's going to be really fun. You want to really pay attention to this one. It's going to be a lot of fun. So without any further ado, let's go to our interview with Chris Wimmer. Chris, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm very excited to have you. Always happy to talk about the Western history, the Wild West, what was going on. And boy, a lot was going on in 1876. But before we get into that, well, a little bit about yourself. Where did you go to college? Did you study history? Because so much of your podcasts and books are all history-based.
Yeah, I did actually. To slightly back up, I was born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa, and then went to the University of Iowa and majored in communications there with an emphasis in film studies. It's like my whole goal, which we will get into in a second, I'm sure, was to go out to Hollywood and become a writer-director. I had that crazy dream as a kid growing up in the middle of Iowa, but I was always interested in history. And so I had these kind of twin paths in college where I was studying the film industry and also studying history all the time. I took an Old West film class. I took classes about Western history. I took a Vietnam War class. I took all kinds of history classes. I really enjoyed that stuff anyway. And so now, in hindsight, you can very easily see a clear path through all of my years of school to where I am right now and marrying up history and writing. It's a pretty clear path.
But it's wonderful work you do, and it really is. It makes history come alive, and I really enjoy it. But now you said you worked in Hollywood. How long were you out in Hollywood?
I did. I was there for 14 years. I actually was one of the fortunate ones who was able to go out to Hollywood and get a job and able to sustain myself out there. And again, with the goal of ultimately being a director at some point. But I worked a lot of low-level jobs in the beginning, like most people do. I was a production assistant and did a lot of low-level stuff. And one thing led to another. I ended up working at a startup television network, which was a really interesting experience, and learned a lot of video production skills. And then in the last 6 years of the time that I was out there, I was finally really able to focus on still pursuing the dream of becoming a director, but using the writing path to hopefully get in that door. So I was working with a screenwriting partner, and he and I wrote screenplays for 6 years. And we had the whole works. We had a manager and an agent, and we went all over the city to all the major movie studios and production companies and had meetings and got to experience some of those things that would be like, childhood daydreams. But then ultimately never were able to sell a script. We ended up hitting that wall that so many people hit. We wrote a bunch of scripts. We got really close to selling a couple of them, but we could just never get over the hump. And after 6 years of struggling it out and working odd video jobs to survive, I just thought, it's time for me to try to do something else. I need to do something on a daily basis that I'm going to enjoy and that, of course, is going to pay me a decent salary. And so that's when I decided to leave and transition to the journalism world. I thought if there's anything else I was going to do other than write movies, it would be to write about college football. I'm a huge college football fan, and so I decided that's going to be my next career. I'm going to leave Hollywood And I came here to where I am right now, to Phoenix, Arizona, and went to Arizona State University and the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and got a master's degree in journalism and began the new career path of maybe someday being a national college football reporter and traveling to all the big games all over the country. That was the new dream. And then during that whole transitional period of moving out of Hollywood into journalism and then starting my new journalism career in sports writing, is when I really got interested in podcasts.
Okay. Well, wow. I'll tell you, I bet you're happy you're not a screenwriter or a writer out in Hollywood right now.
Yeah, these are rough times. I was there, of course, for the 2007 writer's strike, but I wasn't the writer at that time. So I didn't, wasn't going through it then. And now seeing what the writers are going through again, it's scary. It's scary to be one of those guys now.
A few weeks ago, I did at the end of my podcast, I always say I'm looking at something. I was looking at an old Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn movie, and done in 1957, and it was about bringing a computer into a research department, and the computer taking over the jobs of the researchers. And they were saying, we're losing our jobs to the machines. And I'm sitting there going, my God, 60 years later, and that's what we're hearing with the AI and everything else. Same stuff.
Yeah, it is incredible how prescient and how some of those movies can foreshadow some things that we're starting to deal with now. I can say, having, looked at some of this AI stuff, because it is such a huge deal with the Hollywood writers and Hollywood actors and just the emergence of this new technology that seems to have exploded onto the scene, that I personally don't think the writers have a lot to worry about at this moment. Some of the AI writing programs that I've dabbled with, I don't know if they're good enough to do the high quality dramatic writing that's needed especially for books. For screenplays, it's kind of a different animal. But they seem to be really good at writing blog posts or stuff like that. But I don't know if I would ever trust an AI to certainly not to write a novel or something like that. So hopefully we still have a few more years before the machines have fully taken over.
I agree. Let's hope so. Now, you started Black Barrel Media. I love the name, Black Barrel Media. And,
thank you.
And you have, and of course, as we said, Legends of the Old West podcast. But you've done more than just that podcast, haven't you?
Yeah, my company, my sister and I formed Black Barrel Media after I started Legends of the Old West. I started Legends of the Old West just as a side project. As I was saying a second ago, I was really becoming interested in podcasts, and I could see the creativity that some people were using. And I loved the idea that if you could make your own podcast, if you could do it, you could deliver it right to the audience. You didn't have all the bureaucracy of Hollywood and needing 15 people to sign off on buying your script and then 150 to sign off on making the movie if you got that lucky. You didn't have any of that. If you could just make it, you could deliver it to the audience. And so once I made Legends of the Old West and people started liking it, I called my sister and said, we've talked about maybe forming some sort of company to combine our various experiences and skill sets. Maybe this should be it, a podcast production company. Maybe it starts as audio and grows into an audio video company. Who knows where it could go? So we created Black Barrel Media after Legends of the Old West, and then almost immediately created a second American history podcast called Infamous America, which focuses on, and it's a very literal title, anyone or anything that could be considered infamous in American history. And we've gone on to do several other kinds of podcasts. And I know we'll probably get into another American history one toward the end of the show here, but we're releasing a big new military history podcast in a couple months, depending on when your listeners hear this, I guess.
Wow. Now, are you able to do multiple podcasts at the same time? For instance, if you're doing Legends of the Old West, do you also have time then to do the one on Infamous America, or are they separate?
Well, I work on both at the same time, but what we had to do eventually was to evolve out of what was happening initially. Initially, in the early stages, so probably the first year and a half to 2 years, I was doing everything wall to wall, all the research, all the writing, all the recording, all the editing, all the mixing, even though I didn't really know how to do any of that stuff. The only thing I wasn't doing was actually creating the music, but I would lay it into the shows, and I was doing everything wall to wall, and it was so time consuming that it took a long time to get each new series out. And we knew that if we were going to start a business out of this, we could not have 2 months between our series or our seasons. That was just never going to be sustainable. So we eventually started putting the call out and started working with researchers and writers. So now most of the series that you hear on Legends of the Old West or Infamous America are originally researched and written by someone else. And then I come in and do a polish on the top and make it sound a little more like me and make it just simply easier for me to read, because I'm not a professional audiobook narrator or anyone like that. I'm certainly not an actor. So, I struggle to read some of these things. So I need it to be written kind of in a certain way so that I don't trip over every other word. I tell you what, doing this, you develop very quickly a massive appreciation for audiobook narrators. I really don't know how those people are able to do it day in and day out. It's difficult.
It's an art form, to be very honest with you.
100%. It absolutely is. I have massive respect, even more than I used to. I mean, I've always loved audiobooks, but man, try doing it yourself for a while and you develop a whole new respect.
Oh, I try to read a chapter of a book every morning to my wife, who's from Romania, and not the best at reading English, but speaks it very well. But I try to read a chapter every morning to her. And I'll tell you, after around 5 pages, I'm tongue-tied, I'm gasping for breath, I need coffee or something.
100%. Your jaw hurts. My jaw starts hurting if I talk. It's a whole different thing. People can talk. We could sit here and talk for an hour like we're going to, but reading something and then having to do it a little bit dramatically, and that it's a whole different animal.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Well, you're now in season 30, and friends, I just finished his second episode of season 30, which is on a riverboat gambler, which is out of this world. When did you begin? Not 30 years ago. When did you begin Legends of the Old West?
Yeah, we're experimenting maybe with going away from this seasonal format. Again, that was something that was a holdover from the early days when it took a long time to release each new season. So we're maybe going to toy with it so it doesn't have this kind of seasonal breakup. But regardless, I started working on it I committed myself to doing it in, I think, about November of 2017. And then I spent the first 4 months of 2018 working nonstop, basically starting January 1st until I released the first episode on April 1st, 2018. And at that point, I was still a full-time, small-town newspaper reporter. So I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do research and siphon time away from my workday to work on the podcast. And I would work in the evenings when I got home, and I was putting myself through this grind. And that's a lot of what led to calling my sister eventually in May of 2018 and saying, I basically have to choose here. I can't keep doing both of these at the same time. It's way too much. So that's when we decided that to take the plunge into an industry neither of us knew anything about. And that was in hindsight, that was just crazy. I almost can't believe we did it, but it's worked out well so far.
Thank God the cavalry arrived, because they certainly have done a great job without there.
And I tell you this, too, it wouldn't have happened if people weren't interested in the American West. And I think that's the great credit, that what I discovered immediately was that even though I was a true novice in producing a podcast, I discovered immediately that there was an appetite for Old West stories. Even now, when Hollywood ebbs and flows with its interest in Hollywood properties and, in novels and nonfiction books, there is still an appetite for stories about the American West, and we certainly wouldn't have a company now if that wasn't true.
Yes, that's one of my pet peeves. There's no longer, you go to a bookstore or anywhere, there's nothing Western fiction anymore. That's gone, and so few books are written out there, and most of them are very scholarly tomes. It's so fun to get to a book like yours, to get to The Summer of 1876, to get to some of Tom Clavin's books, to get to the books that historian H.W. Brands is putting out. I did a great one on the last campaign. It's fun to read this, but I'm not sure if the word's getting out to people.
That is the tough part. That's where it helps for me to have a podcast as a vehicle to promote the books. And certainly I'm under no illusions. I was thrilled. I was over the moon that St. Martin's Press was interested in my book idea. But I also knew that I had a built-in marketing platform that was at least half of the interest in it that I could reach out to. And if you don't have an established platform already, it's just so difficult now with so many ways to consume things. It almost works against an author. Yes, you can promote yourself on all the different social media platforms, but they're saturated and inundated with millions or billions of other people. So, having a way to get your book idea out there into the world is just as key as the idea itself in these days.
No doubt about it. Now, did you grow up reading Western novels And did you like the West as a kid?
Yeah, I'm kind of a mixed bag. I loved the West as a kid, but I did not grow up reading Western novels or really Western nonfiction books. My love of the West almost was, what do I want to say, almost by osmosis or subliminal, that my parents grew up in the 50s and 60s when the Westerns were king, and Gunsmoke and Bonanza and all those shows were on TV, and the John Wayne Westerns in the movie theaters. And so in our household, my sister and I grew up with all those TV shows, the reruns playing on TV every weekend. With Gunsmoke would lead into Bonanza, would lead into Big Valley, would lead into all these other shows. So our parents watched this stuff a lot. And I think now looking back, where the audio side of it and maybe the interest in the more dramatic side really came to the forefront was every time we would take a drive down to our uncle's farm. Our uncle lived on a farm almost exactly an hour away from our house in Des Moines. So this 1 hour drive from our house to our uncle's farm, my dad would put on a Louis L'Amour audio dramatization. So in back in the 80s and 90s, Louis L'Amour's publishing companies took his short stories and turned them into 1 hour audio dramas with a full cast of characters and music and sound effects, and they're gripping. They're fantastic. So we listen to these things all the time. And so now that really helped us get addicted. And now we're basically doing the same thing. My sister and I have come full circle, and we are now making things very similar to the stuff we used to listen to in the 80s and 90s, driving to our uncle's house and driving on any kind of family trip. And so that's where the love of the West came from. It was kind of ingrained in us. And then when I decided I was going to make a podcast, there were really no podcasts out there in 2017, 2018 that were doing long form, in-depth, entertaining storytelling with music and sound effects that we're producing on a regular basis. Some of them were dabbling, but they were very infrequent. And so I thought, man, I could do some of that Louis L'Amour stuff that I heard, and I could start reading about all this stuff I had never really read about before. I was very much influenced by movies and TVs, but that's what it really hit me. I loved the movie Tombstone. That was a family favorite, but I had never read detailed accounts of the actual true events. And it kind of hit me like, my God, how did I get to this point without ever having actually read a book about Tombstone? This is crazy. And so that whole need to know and desire to know for myself also helped spawn the podcast.
I love Tombstone. Oh my, that is such a fine show. And yet, as much as Val Kilmer was great as Doc Holliday with his line, "I'm your Huckleberry," I thought that in the other one, Wyatt Earp, that Costner did, I thought that Dennis Quaid actually looked more like Doc Holliday would have.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, Dennis Quaid did a really good job of certainly appearing like Doc Holliday and having the mannerisms and maybe the voice qualities. I mean, we don't really know what Doc Holliday sounded like, so it's kind of anybody's guess. We know he had a Georgia accent, but not a whole lot beyond that.
No, he lost 60 pounds for that.
I know. Exactly. If you could blend those two guys, if you could kind of add the charisma and the one-liners of Val Kilmer's performance and transplant them onto the visuals of Dennis Quaid's performance, you'd have maybe the perfect Doc Holliday.
It was wonderful. Wonderful. Good. I love Tombstone. I better get off of that. Anyway,
I agree.
Your first book now, I'm assuming this is your first book. It's the summer of 1876. Now, did you always want to do that year? Did something jump up at you and make you say, hey, I got to write about this year?
I did very much was the second one. It jumped up, and it came straight out of the podcast. It's really interesting to me how one thing leads into another and everything is connected, which I hope comes through in the book that we're probably going to talk about. That's how I like to tell stories. And that's exactly what happened for me, that in the early stages of researching and writing the Legends of the Old West podcast, when I was doing everything by myself, the stories that I ended up choosing to be the first ones to tell on the podcast all synced up together. So by the time when the book idea hit me, almost like an epiphany in the summer of 2019, and I had done all the research for doing a series on Tombstone and the gunfight at the OK Corral. So I'd read biographies of Wyatt Earp. I had done stories on Deadwood and Wild Bill Hickok. I had done a whole series on Jesse James. So I'd already researched all of those things. I'd done a series on Red Cloud's War. I knew I was going to, of course, do a series on the Last Stand, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So all of these things were already swirling around in my mind. And at some point, I was sitting there with all my research in front of me thinking, wait, didn't I just read that date? I started really looking at the date and thought, my God, so many things that were big, pivotal events in the history of the Old West that featured some of the biggest names and personalities of the Old West all happened in about a 90-day space of time. And so once that hit me, I thought, oh man, that's a really interesting concept. And I was already doing each one of them individually on the podcast. And my sister and I had been to 2 conventions of the Western Writers of America Association. And so I had this, the idea of books in my head. We met lots of authors and publishers. So when the idea hit me for the concept, I thought, well, this might be a really interesting book instead of a podcast series. Since I'm doing them all individually on the podcast, what if you combine them into one book? I've never seen that book before. And so that's where the idea came from.
Wow. Well, let me tell you, I never realized it. And I used to do a lot of reading about Westerns and Western history, and I never put everything together myself. And it's like, oh my God, this happened and this happened and this happened. And then when Wild Bill, oh my, that was too much for me. Oh, I didn't realize that was a year. So anyway, you choose to focus on around 5 or 6 different moments, okay, and hit major things. But did you have to whittle anything out? Was there something you had to leave out of this book?
Oh yeah, there was a lot that had to be left out. And then I don't want to shortchange my own book. I would do a really terrible job of pitching it, but like there are some things that I really wanted to include that are a little disjointed and not super connected to the American West. Because I had already also done a series about the 1919 World Series baseball scandal, the Black Sox scandal, I knew that the first year of play for the National League was 1876. And I just had to include that in the book. I had to put a thread in there that traced at least a little bit of the origins of the National League and some of the highlights of that very first season. And so that's, it happened during that time period, but it's not really connected to the Old West, but I included it anyway. So I could have maybe taken that out. But there were lots of other, Native American stories that were happening during that time. And I could have, at one point I thought about maybe putting some threads in there about the Apache Wars that were happening down in Arizona. But the major hot spots of those wars were not happening actually in the year of 1876. So I started pairing things out, and it's like there's already so many different storylines and so many different people that the audience is going to have to track. I really should just limit it to what I have here and not go too far overboard.
Well, I appreciate you putting in baseball, and I love that you got in my good buddy Candy Cummings. How did you stumble upon Candy Cummings?
Yeah, that's a fun story. Yeah, it was. I think it just certainly traces its history back to season 2 of Infamous America, which is the Black Sox story. I went way down a rabbit hole researching that. I was never a baseball fan, but I was always a baseball history fan. I enjoyed the old days, the early days of baseball, and seeing how it all got started and those early heroes of baseball. Was really interested in that, though I'm not, a modern day baseball watcher. And so during the process of writing the story of the 1919 World Series and the Black Sox scandal, I ended up basically researching the entire history of baseball from start to finish, from the earliest days and tracing its history back to games that were played in Great Britain and maybe its migration over to America and how it evolved. And I found the story of Candy Cummings. And then I also, part of that research process was watching Ken Burns' fantastic documentary called Baseball. And I believe he highlights the story in that documentary too. And it just always stuck in my head. It's like, man, that's a really cool story. The first guy to throw a curveball, the first guy we know about, I guess, the first documented case of the curveball. And it also happened to be in the year 1876 that he was playing professional baseball. So I think I don't care what else happens. I've got to get that story in the book somehow.
Fascinating story about Candy Cummings. When you go to the Hall of Fame, I don't know if you've ever been there. When you walk up to the plaque room, you go up this ramp, and there are all these photographs of the beginnings, of all the people from the beginning, of the founders. And there's Wrigley in there, and there's Spalding in there, and Ruth is in there, et cetera. And there's Candy Cummings, okay? And most people don't realize who this guy is. It's Candy Cummings. And I was lucky enough, because I was doing research and involved in something with the Hall at one time, that I got the person was telling me about this. And he said, that's Candy Cummings. Oh, my God, I love this guy. He goes, that's not him. I said, what do you mean it's not him? There's this picture. There are no pictures of Candy Cummings. We used his brother It's his brother's
Oh, my
picture.
gosh.
And so if you go to the hall and you see Candy Cummings, it ain't Candy Cummings.
Oh
So-
my, I didn't know that. So I've been tricked this whole time, just like everyone else. I have an image in my head of how I picture Candy Cummings, and that is wrong. And actually, now that you've said that, I got a great one for you. Going back to the movie Tombstone and the story of Tombstone, the most viewed photo that you will see that's associated with Doc Holliday is not Doc Holliday. That classic photo of the guy with the dark hair and the big, broad, bushy black mustache, that's not Doc Holliday. That's a former mayor of Tombstone, and the photo was misattributed to Doc Holliday for all these generations.
Oh, my word.
And the truth was finally discovered just here in the last 20 years, between 2000 to now. I don't remember exactly what year, but early 2000s, the actual original photo, I'm pretty sure it was the original photo, was discovered, I think, in archives in Tucson. And so the photo that everyone thinks is Doc Holliday is not Doc Holliday. Though if you do enough research, you will find there are 2 verified photos of Doc Holliday. Only 2. And the one that everyone thinks is him is not one of those 2.
That's a great one. I didn't know that. Well, thank you for straightening me out on that. I like that.
We give and take. You've got one and I've got one. That's the only one I knew about.
Yep. Well, now, there are a lot of really big things that happened in 1876, but I think most Americans are familiar with what we call Custer's Last Stand, okay? Your book, though, traces the history of that, and it started the year before, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it started you can trace it back to who knows how far, but yeah, the real push started in 1875 when America was in the grip of the Panic of 1873. We were in a financial crisis that had been going on for a couple of years, and President Ulysses S. Grant was desperate to find money for the country. Everyone was desperate to find money. Plus, there's the obvious, desire for finding riches that goes beyond just helping a struggling economy. Everybody wants to be the next billionaire and find the next gold mine, so that was always present everywhere. But by 1875, Ulysses S. Grant was trying to buy the Black Hills from the Lakota because they had been ceded the Black Hills during a treaty that happened in 1868 after Red Cloud's War. But now in 1875, with the panic, the country in a financial crisis and just basic simple greed, the president tried to buy the Black Hills, and Red Cloud, as the representative of the Lakota, kept saying no. So by the end of the year, Grant felt he had no choice but to agree to a plan to simply take the Black Hills and force the remaining free-roaming Lakota onto actual reservations rather than just allowing them to roam through lands that had been given by treaty. It was time to force them onto reservations. And so he agreed to a plan to start that process early in 1876. And then it's one of those classic stories where if any one thing had gone differently, if everything hadn't lined up in exactly the right order, it would not have led to Custer's Last Stand. And so it's always one of those moments where you can look back and think, man, what would have happened if the plan had gone according to plan at any point in time?
Right, which according to your book and the research was supposed to be a winter campaign.
Yeah, General Phil Sheridan was the primary architect of the campaign to send 3 Army columns out into the field and try to force the Native American tribes onto reservations during the winter months, because they would be scattered in their winter camps. They would be, they wouldn't have the supplies. Their horses would be weakened by months of living in the winter. It would be the most ideal time to try to attack and subdue a Native American camp. But of course, there's a reason why no one ever tried that. You're trying to march through the northern plains in the middle of winter. It's brutal conditions. But he wanted to try it anyway, and so he put a plan in place to start the campaign against the tribes of the northern plains in February of 1876, and then it was just one delay after another.
Including some with Custer. Custer himself got involved in this whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, Custer's love of being the center of attention and probably saying too much ended up causing at least a month's worth of delays, where he got embroiled in testifying at some committee hearings in Washington, and he just he buried himself in it a little bit and got himself on the outs with the president and the Army brass, and so he created a bit of his own scandal there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a big moment. It was a huge moment, and we have, again, when you talk about things, I remember used to be able to go into bars and public houses, then there'd be a picture of everybody basically dead and Custer still standing there shooting. It's another misconception. That didn't happen that way.
Yeah, that famous painting, I was fortunate enough to interview Craig Johnson, the gentleman who writes the Longmire novels. And he loves that story of telling the story of I think it was Anheuser-Busch, the beer company, that created this really famous painting that they sold tons of copies to. They used to hang in all the bars in the West. And I think please, anyone who wants to research this, don't quote me on it. This is how I remember it from doing an interview years ago. But I think it was Anheuser-Busch that created this really famous painting. And of course, it's not even remotely accurate in terms of what happened. But because it hung over bars in the West for generations, that had that kind of subliminal osmosis effect, like I was saying earlier about how I got interested in the West. And people just started to believe it, that's what actually happened.
No doubt about it. Well, the thing is that you bring up another confrontation, which I think is just as, well, not as important, and I think is more overlooked, was the Battle of the Rosebud. And that sort of was a bit of a precursor to what was going to happen at Little Bighorn.
Yeah, 1 week before the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This is another one of those moments where if certain things had happened differently, who knows how Custer's immediate campaign 1 week later against the largest Native American village in recorded history would have turned out. But 1 week before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, General George Crook led his column of soldiers, called the Wyoming Column, up into southern Montana on an expedition, like just as planned, to try to find this growing camp led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And then he ended up getting attacked by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And it was a long, sustained battle. And it was one of the first, if not the first, long, sustained battle in the Northern Plains, which was pivotal because most times when Army columns fought Native American warriors, it was a very quick thing. The Native American warriors struck once or twice, and then they pulled away. It was not a 6-hour sustained battle, but that's what the Battle of the Rosebud was. And eventually, both sides separated. The warriors felt they had done enough, and they rode away. The Army column retreated back down into Wyoming, and then Crook didn't tell any of the other commanders who were in the field trying to find the Native American warriors that he had just fought this battle, which is one of those moments that if he had just communicated to Custer and Custer's superior, General Alfred Terry, or if he had communicated to Colonel John Gibbon, who was leading another column, if he had communicated to either of the two other columns that this had just happened, and here's where it happened, and here's where I think the village is where these warriors came from, who knows what would have happened. But he didn't. He told his superiors, Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman, but he didn't communicate to the immediate commanders in the field.
I tell you. And to me, it's just amazing. I read the book, and I just am amazed at having been out there, the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming. How do you even find somebody? I mean, back in 1876, you were looking everywhere. Where are they? Where are the Indians? Where are they at? They couldn't find them. They're going hundreds of miles to try to find somebody. And eventually they did, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is one of those things where nowadays, when you read it, you think, well, how is that possible? And it's how is it possible for such a huge society, 7, 8, 9, maybe 10,000 total people in this village? How can no one find them? And then you go out there and you actually stand at the Little Bighorn battlefield in the National Park and the National Monument, and you look around at the hills, and when you drive through those hills to get to the battlefield, and then you picture what it was like in 1876, you can easily see how a huge group of people can hide, because the distance is so vast and the landscape is such rolling hills and trees and mountains that can hide people. You can understand how it was so difficult to find even a very large society with the very limited communications and technology that were available. It was incredibly difficult.
Yep, no doubt. Well, then you take us down to Dodge City. And, an episode that a lot of people aren't familiar with is that's where Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson first get together, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that was where they first teamed up. I think the story is always that they met during a buffalo hunt a year or two earlier, and they would have had to have met at some point earlier. I mean, Wyatt Earp just didn't pick Bat Masterson's name out of a hat when it came time to hire lawmen to work in Dodge City. So they certainly knew each other. But once Wyatt got the job as assistant marshal, and it was his responsibility to hire a new force of lawmen to patrol Dodge City when it was clear that Dodge was going to be the next big cattle hub, that there were about to be waves of cattle and Texas cowboys coming into town like Dodge had never seen before. The founding fathers, the city fathers there decided they needed a whole new police force. And so Wyatt's first call, I guess, it wasn't literally a telephone call, but his first message was to Bat Masterson to come be part of this new force, even as Bat was recovering from a gunshot wound. And Bat signed up, as well as his brother Jim, if my memory serves. And then both Wyatt and Bat kept adding brothers to the mix, and it became a whole Earp Masterson faction over the next couple of years.
No doubt. And, what's interesting is if I'm reading this correctly, Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp had completely different sort of philosophies on how to police. I mean, Masterson, I don't think didn't use his guns very much at all, did he?
No, I believe he was known as a good gunman when he needed to be. He was a good shot and a skilled gunfighter and mostly fearless, but he was not. I think what we see. I think the way I understand it is he was not as kind of stoic and hard-edged as Wyatt Earp was. I think Wyatt Earp was not. I think it's a little bit too much to maybe call Wyatt Earp quick to violence, but he just didn't have patience for any crap. Basically, if somebody was acting up, he was quick to just whack him over the head with a pistol, drag him to jail. Let's just get this over with. I don't want to stand here negotiating with a drunk to give up his guns and to try to come peacefully. Just knock him out and take him to jail was more Wyatt Earp's philosophy, whereas Bat was a little bit more of a talker and would use his words maybe a little bit more before he resorted to any kind of violence, and Wyatt just didn't have the patience for that.
Wow. Well, then you take us up, and again, and this is not one versus the other. It's just not sequentially, but we go up to Deadwood, and now we meet Wild Bill and a little bit of Calamity Jane, and they had a fascinating relationship that wasn't the relationship that we know once again.
Yeah, that's also one of the great legends and misconceptions of the American West, was that there was a romantic relationship between Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane. And to the best that anyone can trace, that rumor / misconception probably started with Jane years after Wild Bill died. She was a known storyteller and a known talker, and for at least a lot of her life, a very heavy drinker. And so she probably very much was infatuated. She probably was in love with Bill, but he did not have reciprocal romantic interest. So over the years, she started telling people that they did have this romantic relationship, but it really wasn't true. So you get a little bit of Calamity Jane in this book, because she is such a colorful character, and she was there in Deadwood during that pivotal first summer. But Bill is mostly the star of that summer of '76.
And again, I didn't know this. I don't know what I've been reading. I have to keep admitting to you, I don't know this. I never knew that at that time in the summer of '76 that Wild Bill was married.
Yeah, he had just gotten married. He'd only been married for a couple months. And that's another one of the things that I personally end up finding fascinating. Maybe not specifically the marriage aspect, but that he was only 39 years old. And I always pictured him as such an older fella, but he was only 39 years old, but he seemed to have lived the lives of 10 men. And he had just gotten married and was trying to, ostensibly on the surface, trying to find a stake for his wife, even though she was pretty well off herself and didn't really need the money. He still had this idea that he needed to provide for his new wife and for possibly his growing family. Yet at the same time, he really wasn't that serious about it. He really he didn't make any attempt to go pan for gold or dig for gold to find that stake for his wife. He really just wanted to go gamble. And by that time, he was already having pretty dark premonitions that maybe his time was running short. And so it led to what ended up happening in Deadwood.
Yes. And, before he got there, he was on the stage. He was an actor. Not very good, but he was an actor.
Probably the worst, what he would say was probably the worst experience of his life. He hated acting, was not very good at it, and just couldn't wrap his head around it, and basically took the money. He was paid a crazy amount of money. We started doing the conversions of the money that Buffalo Bill and the stage company made during those years of touring with those couple plays, Scouts of the Prairie and then Scouts of the Plains. They made a ton of money. And so Wild Bill jumped at the opportunity to make money, and he suffered through it for a few months and then just decided, I'm done. I've had enough of this. And then he evolved from there. He got married and went to Deadwood, and the rest is history.
And the rest is history. And had he asked somebody for a different seat at the table, he might still have been alive at the end of the summer.
Might have, yeah. That's always the rumor too. You read tons of sources that say he always liked to sit with his back to the wall, and I probably did. It's a smart play for a guy who knows that he has a target on his back in an almost literal way. But I also, for every source that I read that said, yep, he always liked to sit with his back against the wall, and he tried to get that chair during his last moments, I can find at least one other source that says, no, that's just us projecting our modern sensibilities onto him. We don't have any concrete proof that he actually always sat with his back against the wall and that he actually asked for that chair. So it's really hard to sort out what actually happened, what's real with those final moments. But regardless, if he had been sitting with his back against the wall in those final few moments in the number 10 saloon, that also might have turned out completely differently.
Exactly. Now, one thing, we say that Wild Bill was a gambler, but he wasn't a con man, was he?
No, he just loved to gamble. He just wanted to win at the poker tables.
That's what I thought, but now after listening to that thing about the con man, the riverboat gambler, I'm thinking, oh God, maybe Wild Bill had a little bit of the con in him, but
yeah,
no.
maybe he learned a couple tricks, and we don't really know for sure. But as far as we know, he wasn't the guy who would like deal from the bottom of the deck or pull any of these other kind of elaborate card games. He just was I think he was a straight up poker player, or maybe some faro and whatever else. But I don't think he had the con artist streak in him, though. He wanted to win, so you can't put it past him.
No doubt. Now we go to the last big thing about the book, and I think it's one of the last things you even write about in depth, is the Northfield Bank robbery. Now, I didn't know a lot about this. It took place up in Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's a small town south of Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Okay. And who was involved in that?
It was the James Younger gang. This was the last hurrah of the James Younger gang that had been the premier outlaws of the American West for 10 years, starting right after the Civil War and then leading up to this bank robbery in Minnesota. And this was another thing that, I had heard about at various points in time doing research and reading about the Old West, but like you, until I started researching it for the podcast series, I didn't know the details. And once I read the details of not only the bank robbery itself, but the epic 2-week saga that comes right after the bank robbery, where the gang is on the run, that I was shocked and fascinated. This is incredible. I cannot believe that I've never seen a really good movie about this, or even a multi-episode TV show. This is crazy. And so I was really thankful, selfishly, that event happened in the summer of 1876, because then I could write about it in my book. Because I found it fascinating. So yes, the quick version, to hopefully not take anything away from the book or anyone who wants to read a different book about it, is that the James Younger gang made one of its very rare forays outside of its stronghold of Missouri. The gang of 8 men traveled up to Minneapolis and started scouting banks to rob in the Minnesota area, and they eventually settled on Northfield. And they rode into town in their kind of classic robbery formation that they had developed over the last couple years. They had a whole plan of attack, and from minute one, it went wrong. And so it's just a domino effect of one thing led to another. Once one thing failed in the plan, it led to chaos, and everything started failing. And so they got into a shootout with the townspeople. The townspeople realized their bank was being robbed in a kind of classic thing that was been replicated in 100 other movies and TV shows. They grabbed their guns and started fighting against the gang that was robbing their bank, and killed a couple of the bank robbers and chased the rest out of town. And then the gang spent 2 weeks on the run through southern Minnesota to try to escape local posses at every point along the way, and huge posses that were coming down from the big cities. And at one point, the U.S. Army gets involved, and it's just, they're being chased by hundreds of people throughout southern Minnesota, and it really is a crazy story.
No doubt. And they are, I don't know if it's aided, but it's certainly didn't hinder the horrible rainstorm for like around 2 weeks. It just rained continually, and they were able to hide.
Yes, this happened in early September. So they got these almost, I think there were some accounts that said that if they weren't absolutely historic rainstorms, then they were very close. It was one of the wettest early fall periods that anyone could remember. It was just torrential rain day after day after day. So these guys are riding horses that they had taken from Northfield and then swapping them for horses that they stole, or just walking they're in the most miserable conditions in these deep, dark woods with God knows how many mosquitoes and everything else, and trying to forage off the land. And almost all of them are injured from the shootout in Northfield, some to certainly really bad extents. So they're in pain, they're suffering through the weather conditions day after day, they're living off the land, they're starving. It was just as miserable as it could be. It was basically like what you would equate to modern day elite military training exercises, where they have to send elite soldiers out into the woods and they're chased by people who are trying to hunt them and they have to live off the land. This was essentially the same thing for these guys in 1876.
Well, we don't want to get into the whole story, how it ends and everything else, but that was a fascinating saga went on in 1876, ending up with the Northfield Bank robbery, and just a wonderful, wonderful book. Now, tell me, Chris, what's coming next? You got a new book, you got a new podcast. What's coming up in your life?
Hopefully both of those things.
Both.
I actually have an idea for a direct follow-up to the summer of 1876, a pretty natural extension of that book that I'm hoping to pitch to the publisher very soon, actually, as we record this here in August 2023. So hopefully, maybe if somebody listens to this a year from now, the book will already be in the works. That's the hope. But I can't reveal anything about it now, other than it's an Old West book that would be a direct follow-up. So I'm really hoping that the publisher wants that one and I can get to work on it immediately. And then, yes, much more recently, I guess is not the right word, but much more immediately after we're recording this interview, in late September 2023, our company has partnered with another podcast company called Q Code. So Black Barrel Media and Q Code are teaming up to produce a military history podcast called Mission History. And the trailer is out now, depending on when you listen to this. And season 1 is, again, to use the same phrase, the epic saga of the American Revolutionary War. So I've spent weeks, maybe even months now, researching the American Revolutionary War, and we're putting a focus on the Southern theater, the Southern campaigns in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia that almost always get overlooked by the history books. And there's some very special components to this, and I won't drone on too much longer about it, but we were very fortunate to be part of some once-in-a-lifetime ceremonies back in April of 2023, where Revolutionary War soldiers, their graves in a specific battlefield were being destroyed at such a rough extent that a bunch of goodwill historical societies and the U.S. Army teamed up to exhume some of these soldiers and rebury them with full military honors so that their graves would be secured. And they hosted elaborate ceremonies that were really incredible. So my sister and I were there filming and recording audio. And so the series that's coming out that starts in September is going to be a hybrid. It's going to be a long form, I hope, really interesting version of the American Revolutionary War. And then we're doing a couple audio documentary episodes where we really dive into the ceremonies and the archaeology and the forensics that's being done to try to maybe identify the families of some of these soldiers. So it's going to be a really interesting series, unlike anything we've ever done before.
Well, if you aren't from down here in the South, you probably never heard of the Battle of Cowpens. And Francis Marion did have a TV show with Disney, I think, the Swamp Fox. That came out of Charleston. And then you have Kings Mountain, which was a big area in the North Carolina-South Carolina border. So I'm aware of a few of these places. I can't wait to get into the whole thing because it's going to be a fascinating listen, a fascinating journey. And I always wish somebody would write a good book just on the Johnson County Wars. I'm fascinated by that because a lot of that whole thing is the Billy the Kid and what went on there. And again, things that are attributed to him that didn't happen to him. So one day.
Yeah. All right, so first of all, I just wrote about those battles. So it's really interesting for you to hear someone talk about them. Kings Mountain and Cowpens, and the Battle of Camden is the one that came before that. And Camden is the one that we are really focusing on because that's where the soldiers' bodies were buried in very, very shallow graves, and they were really being defiled over the years. So the Battle of Camden is a kind of tentpole moment in the podcast series, and of course, Kings Mountain and Cowpens come right after that. So I was just writing about those within the last couple of days. And then were you asking about Billy the Kid? Were you talking about the Lincoln County War? Or
Lincoln County. Lincoln County.
Yeah, Lincoln County down in New Mexico. Yes, that's been a favorite topic of mine too. And actually, fun tidbit: there's a guy in Lincoln County who's a professional map maker. He works for the Department of the Interior and makes amazing professional GPS located maps, and he loves the Old West, and he's done a deep dive into Billy the Kid history, and he's made these incredible maps about where the exact places are, where all the different things happened in the Lincoln County Wars and the Billy the Kid story. And he made the maps for my book. His name is Billy Roberts, and his company is called Bad Hoss Maps. And so if you really want to see an amazing map, if you're interested in that story, check out his Bad Hoss Map Company and look at his Billy the Kid map. He and his partner down there, who was the historian in that area, they know more about Billy the Kid than I could probably ever learn. And so that was a really fun experience to get to work with him to make the maps for my book, and then talk to he and his business partner about all this deep dive Billy the Kid history.
Yeah. Wow. Well, maybe someday he's going to write more about it, because it's a fascinating saga, fascinating stories. Chris, this has gone by. Good Lord, we're almost at an hour, and I could go another hour with you, my friend. You are a fascinating guy, and your stories are great. I can see why people love your podcast, because you're a natural storyteller, and I really, really appreciate you coming here on the show.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I can't believe we've gone an hour now, too. I could definitely do this for another hour. We could just talk through the entire book, story after story, and just reveal all the secrets. But then, of course, no one would have any reason to buy it. But yeah, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, friends, we'll be right back in a moment. Well, thanks so much, Chris. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Chris is a wonderful guest. This book is extremely readable. It's a fast-paced book. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Like I said, I wasn't aware of all the coincidences, all the things that came together back in 1876. Now, one thing I've never done before, but I want us to do it right now. If you have a few minutes, please go to Chris's podcast. Now, I've never recommended another podcast to you folks, but I don't think you're going to go wrong. Don't think you're going to go wrong at all. Legends of the Old West. You want to learn about some stories, some history. I just got done one on the swindlers and the gamblers back in the old days. There's a wonderful 6-part episode on Kit Carson, things you never knew, okay? So if you get a chance, give Chris's podcast a try after you listen to Books and Looks. So anyway, on behalf of viewsandbooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.